Are radical protesters taking over London's streets? Conservative author Douglas Murray thinks so. From controversial chants to cancelled events, Murray pulls no punches in his critique of recent pro-Palestinian demonstrations. But are his views justified? Douglas Murray, the outspoken British author and political commentator, has been making waves with his sharp criticism of pro-Palestinian protests sweeping across London and other major cities. Murray argues these demonstrations have gone beyond legitimate free speech and are causing significant disruption and unease.
We have seen hundreds of thousands of people killed in the last decade in Yemen, Muslims being killed. There's no one on the streets of Melbourne. Nobody is standing outside the Sydney Opera House calling gas the Hutu, or gas the Houthi, gas the Shia, gas the... Nobody's marching for the dead Muslims in Yemen.
Murray is calling out what he sees as glaring double standards in pro-Palestinian protests. He points to hundreds of thousands of Muslims killed in Syria's civil war and Yemen over the past decade, yet notes there are no mass protests in Sydney, Melbourne, or London for these victims. Murray asks, where are the people marching for the dead Muslims in Yemen? He challenges the notion of Muslim solidarity, claiming Muslims don't actually care about their co-religionists as much as we're led to believe. Murray cites the lack of support for Palestinians from neighbouring Arab countries as evidence. He questions why Jordanians haven't taken in West Bank Palestinians, or why Egyptians haven't welcomed those from Gaza. Murray suggests the real issue isn't about supporting Palestinians, but a deep-seated hatred of Jews. He calls it an ancient hatred, perhaps the most ancient among the monotheism and the deepest and the ugliest.
Why have the Egyptians made sure that not one Palestinian is allowed to leave Gaza? Why do they make sure that their border wall is tough as anything? What do they mind? One thing: Jews living. Jews living and Jews winning.
He brings up the forced relocation of nearly 2 million Muslims by the Pakistani government into Afghanistan, questioning why this isn't receiving the same level of outrage as actions taken by Israel. Murray points out the silence from Pakistani politicians in the UK on this matter, suggesting a reluctance to criticize their country of origin. We have a very large Pakistani community here in the UK, Murray points out. If their country of origin can do that, why can't we if it comes to that? It's a controversial comparison that's sure to spark debate. Murray questions why this forced relocation isn't being widely condemned as a war crime. He suggests it's due to political considerations within diaspora communities, with Pakistani politicians in the UK reluctant to criticize their country of origin. This all circles back to Murray's central argument that the disproportionate focus on Israel reveals a deeper, more troubling motivation. If you are zooming in on Israel, lambasting Israel, and are basically not bothered with everything else in the world, you're not motivated by anything other than being anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, he asserts. Murray goes further, describing anti-Semitism as a shape-shifting virus that adapts its justifications over time. At times in the past, people didn't like Jews because they were seen to be a different religion, he explains. Then after the wars of religion, you couldn't hate anyone for their religion, so people started to hate the Jews for their race. And after the Holocaust, you couldn't hate people because of their race anymore, so people hated the Jews because of their nation. Murray's critique extends beyond the streets and into the realm of public institutions, particularly the National Health Service, NHS. An interview on Piers Morgan's show with Dr. Abdul Wahed, an NHS doctor and leader of a controversial Islamist movement, has reignited the debate about extremism in British society. The interview, which caused a stir, revealed Dr. Wahed's refusal to condemn Hamas or acknowledge the October 7th attacks as terrorism. Instead, he referred to Hamas as a resistance group and cast doubt on whether civilians were actually massacred during the attacks.
Do you think Hamas are a terror group?
I believe it's a resistance organisation.
Okay. Do you think what they did on October the 7th was a terror attack?
I believe that if civilians got killed on that day, it is appalling. It is appalling.
You're a doctor, man.
It is appalling.
You're a doctor in the NHS. What do you mean if? 1,200 people got massacred.
The controversy surrounding Dr. Wahed's statements brings to light the broader issues Murray has been vocal about: the presence of individuals with extremist views in British institutions and the potential consequences for social cohesion. In the studio discussion following clips from the interview, Dr. Izzeldin Abuelaish, a Canadian-Palestinian medical doctor, attempted to contextualize the use of the term jihad, arguing that it has broader meanings beyond violent struggle. However, this interpretation was strongly contested by Douglas Murray when he joined the conversation. Murray dismissed the broader interpretation of jihad as hogwash, asserting that when used by certain groups, it clearly calls for violence. He criticized what he perceived as attempts to obfuscate the true intentions behind such rhetoric. The debate then shifted to the credibility of casualty figures in Gaza, with Murray challenging the reliability of numbers provided by Hamas. He argued that these figures should not be accepted at face value, given that they come from an organization prescribed as a terrorist group by many countries. Murray also took issue with comparisons between the current situation in Gaza and historical events like World War II, dismissing claims that the destruction in Gaza surpassed that of Germany during the war as factually inaccurate. The discussion reached a crescendo when Murray addressed the central question of whether Dr. Wahed should be allowed to continue practicing as a GP. Murray went further, questioning why individuals with such views are allowed to remain in Britain at all. He characterized the UK as having been a soft touch for decades, allowing the presence of Hamas leaders, terrorist spokespeople, Islamist sympathizers, and now NHS doctors who are members of groups that stand on the streets of London, call for jihad. In a recent interview, Murray expressed his frustration with what he sees as a betrayal of British hospitality. He stated, "These people came into our house, many of them broke into our house illegally. Many of them were never wanted here, and they have come here. They have betrayed all of our attempts at hospitality. They've spat in our faces, and now they want to trample everything we have underfoot." Interestingly, Murray's views have even impacted his ability to speak publicly. A recent fundraiser for an Israeli university was forced to change venue at the last minute after staff at the Apollo Theatre in London refused to work due to Murray's appearance. This incident highlights the polarizing nature of the debate surrounding these issues.
Absolutely outrageous. Sometimes, Julia, I don't recognize our country anymore. It's filled with Islamists parading around the streets praising terrorists and cowards in all positions in public life.
Murray expressed his dismay at this turn of events, stating, "Sometimes, Julia, I don't recognize our country anymore. It's filled with Islamists parading around the streets praising terrorists and cowards in all positions in public life. But what about the protesters themselves?" Murray challenges the notion that all participants in these marches are simply advocating for peace. He points to chants like "From the river to the sea," arguing that such slogans effectively call for the elimination of Israel.
If you call for intifada, you should know what an intifada is. There was an intifada when I was growing up in the late 90s. There was one in the earlier 90s. But the second intifada included suicide bombings against Israelis of the most gruesome type. I mentioned in that piece.
Murray goes so far as to suggest that some protesters may be cosplaying being part of some sort of terror cell on campus. He urges young people to educate themselves about the full meaning of the slogans they're chanting, particularly terms intifada.
But if they're just ignorant, which I really, really hope they are, I hope that, to steal one of the phrases they're so keen on using themselves, they do the work and realize what the words they chant actually mean.
This brings us to a critical point in Murray's argument. He believes that many protesters, particularly young people, may be ignorant of the full implications of their actions. "I hope that, to steal one of the phrases they're so keen on using themselves, they do the work and realize what the words they chant actually mean," Murray states. So, what does Murray propose as a solution? He calls for a more robust enforcement of existing laws against incitement and support for terrorism. Murray argues that the UK government should take a harder line against individuals with ties to groups like Hamas, even suggesting the revocation of citizenship in some cases.
We stripped citizenship from ISIS members of ISIS who, even if they had British citizenship, we stripped their passports.
We stripped citizenship from ISIS members of ISIS who, even if they had British citizenship, we stripped their passports. We need to start doing the same thing with Hamas, Murray asserts. These are undoubtedly controversial proposals, and they raise serious questions about civil liberties, due process, and the limits of state power. Critics might argue that such measures could lead to a slippery slope of government overreach.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, we have a couple of choices clearly at this point. One of them is, and I say this metaphorically for the time being, but it's not that metaphorical. One is to stand up, and the other is to beg on your knees. I don't think that the British public should be on their knees begging, particularly not to people who dislike them. So, best to be on your feet.
But Murray insists that the current situation demands decisive action. He frames the choice facing Britain in stark terms. We have a couple of choices clearly at this point. One of them is, and I say this metaphorically for the time being, but it's not that metaphorical. One is to stand up, and the other is to beg on your knees. Douglas Murray's fiery take on pro-Palestinian protests ignites crucial debates about free speech and national identity. Love him or hate him, he's got us talking. What's your view?